So, Alex, we've been talking about why God would allow evil in the world. And one of the phrases we came up with is that God would ordain, allow, or permit some things in our lives that we have to go through. Question to you this morning is this: why would God allow conflict in churches?
Yeah, so I think there is a simple answer, but then what's interesting is that after you get past the simple answer, I think God has multiple purposes in the many things that he allows. Like he's always up to more than just the singular thing that you can see. So the simple answer is from 1 Corinthians 11:19. It says, "For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." So through allowing conflict in churches, God is able to expose those who are genuine in the faith and those who are holding to something other than the true faith. So there's that, but I don't know that I would call it the privilege, because I'm a pretty conflict averse person. If you know me, I don't actually walk into conflict. Yeah, right. Like, no, I'm just like, no, I'm okay.
Alex, you want to fight?
Right. But I've had the opportunity to, in almost every church that I've been in, be on the front line of significant conflict in that church. So the first church that I had any leadership capacity in, that church closed, and it closed at the end of a major conflict. And what I watched essentially was pride consume a few individuals in the situation. That pride got called out. The person who called out the pride was removed from the church, and then things just slowly declined until the church closed. This all happened over.
Who called it out?
The person was right who called it out. Yeah, and nothing. Nobody repented. Nobody owned their stuff. Right, and it was hard for me to see that at the time. But now that I've reflected on the process, like I discovered that. So it's just like a lack of humility and leadership in the church. Next church I was an intern in that church. I watched conflict between two pastors, that actually there was a fissure in the church that had kind of been covered up, a relational issue that nobody had really dealt with. And one of the pastors unknowingly ended up on the other side of this fissure. He didn't even know that was part of it, because they had never dealt with that kind of underlying conflict. It had risen up again and actually driven both of those pastors apart, and both of them ended up resigning from the church, and really put that church in a hard situation where I think they're just now 8 years later recovering, like starting to recover from the challenge that created. So I walked through that, and then I have been through some other situations too, where the Lord gave me the privilege, like to walk alongside leadership, as I was not directly in the conflict, but I watched the conflict take place. And in every single situation, what was true was that the conflict was being created because somebody lacked humility. Somebody was not willing to admit their wrongs. Somebody was not willing to accept that they had some fault in a situation. And because of that, the thing just crumbled and fell apart. So the Lord has given me the privilege, in all of those situations he's exposing, right? He's showing things, but he's shown me the incredible importance, if I'm going to be in leadership in a church, how I have to be quick to admit my faults, how I have to be quick to own. We did this mediation training one time, and the training said, you may only be responsible for 2% of the conflict, but it is your responsibility to own 100% of that 2% that is on you.
That is a good word.
Yeah, and that value, seeing people so often neglect that along the way, is the reason that the conflicts blew up, because somebody wasn't willing to admit they're wrong, or willing to consider another perspective, or willing to understand the perspective of the other person. That, like, you could almost boil it down purely to that those situations, if there would have been an ounce of humility in some of the people, that they could have gone a lot better. There could have been some reconciliation.
But that's the aggravating part, right? Because if you're the one that goes, okay, I'm willing to solve this by going the humble route.
Right.
And you go I've unfortunately experienced this personally as well.
Watched it from
where, I still remember a guy came into my office and he said, all hell is about to break loose in this church. And I did a historical replay of where I had offended him or what I had done to play in all this. And I hugged him and I actually cried on his shoulder. And he walked out and he brought hell to the church.
Yeah, when you cry on the shoulder of a prideful man, a prideful woman, they see weakness and they exploit it.
Yeah,
that's one of the hardest
aggravating part because you show humility and they walk all over you.
Yeah, the problem is in pride, if you're humble, honest, meek, it's almost like pride is so it disillusions you from seeing anything that's real. And so it actually, it's weird because your humility or our choice to be humble, even though it's like not natural, we have to choose humility. It enables and almost accelerates the division often. And that's what's so hard. It's like, I want to take control by being a butt and like stopping it and like doing everything I can and almost taking control. But I often have to sin in order to do that. So I can't do it. All I can do is like, okay, I have to figure out the humble route.
And potentially open yourself up to attack from the individual.
I feel like humility is like taking your armor and opening it up and saying, here I am, this is all of me. And then they have the freedom to shoot you and kill you, and that's one of the hardest parts of humility.
After dealing with that, again, several instances, I'm not sure. I think there's a level that you expose your humility to. I mean, you always are humble, don't get me wrong. But I think in those situations that I'm specifically referring to, I think in my brokenness, I exposed a little bit too much and gave opportunity to be walked on. The bottom line is it's just aggravating because when you take the righteous route, the evil one seems to walk right over you. So the question is, why we got to allow this? Why would we allow conflict in the church?
Yeah. So there's that exposing piece, right? Which, I mean, both of you, I've been instructed by your stories, just having other righteous people walking alongside you through the conflict is a significant piece of that exposing, because you have people who see the way that you are presenting yourself in humility, and the truth is exposed through that process. I think it's worth saying that comes out. But so now let's take me. I've been on the front line of now 3 significant conflicts, and the next step for me is to go and become a lead pastor of a church. And as soon as I get in that church, not as soon as 6 months into
6 minutes
it,
after.
Right.
Okay. I don't even know what you're about to tell us.
Right. Yeah. So
in case anybody's watching, actually.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll just say I ended up in a conflict. Now, before I tell the story, I just kind of want to throw this verse out here because this passage, it laced through this passage is the requirement of humility, both in leaders, but then also in the congregation. So this is what it says. It says to leaders, to elders, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. You see humility just kind of laced through all of that. And then it goes on and it talks to the church, and it's saying, church, submit yourselves to the elders. And then it says to everybody, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. That as you live this life together, the primary way that we seek to relate to each other is humility is behind all of it. So I get into this situation. I watched this happen. I identified the core issue of humility not being there, right? An accusation. It's not that intense of an accusation, but it was basically saying that I was domineering, that I was taking authority that didn't belong to me, that I had done things without seeking the insight of other leaders, that I was, taking advantage of my authority.
It's interesting for me to hear that accusation, because I could think of 7 accusations given your temperament and leading with you on staff for a couple of years, and that I'm like, I could see somebody saying this,
right?
But that's the anti your temperament.
You don't, right?
You know what I mean? I'm leaning. So maybe you're having a bad month. You know what I mean?
Sure, right.
It's happened. You know what I mean?
Right.
That is contrary to everything you've ever done from Earth until this point. That's totally possible. But that's for real. This is where okay, if I'm your elder at this point, I'm listening.
Right.
I'm skeptical, but I want truth. You know what I mean? You're capable of anything. So
absolutely. So so anyway, in the midst of that situation, I listened to that and I felt so incredibly misunderstood. And what I had to figure out is like, because now I have to go and address this as these accusations come against me. What I had to do is I actually had to say, in what world is it possible that a person could say these things about me? What did I do to give off this effect? Now, I just want to say the way the accusations were hurled, they were hurled in a very, like an intention to hurt, an intention to harm, a desire to bring me down. Like the intensity of passion and anger that was against me in this moment is what brought all of this out.
You threatened an idol.
Right. For sure.
Fair?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair to say. And I had to have the responsibility to call that out but I recognized that the person that I did not value them. I did not love them well, right? And the way that I made the decisions, I did not communicate well. This was probably my biggest struggle, is that in doing something, I did not communicate well. And so I had an option. I could either say, how dare you say these things that are absolutely unwarranted? Look at the people around. I actually could have gone to my elders too and said, you don't see this to be true of me, right? How can you let this person say this of me? I had that opportunity, but I knew that if I did that, I was going to be taking the prideful, self-protective
Michael
route.
and Craig have taught you anything.
That's right.
Take that route.
That's right. And so I started by first owning 100% of everything that I could. And I say all of that to say the lessons learned through that process, the relationship that I now have with that person, it is one of my strongest ministry relationships in the church now.
Beautiful.
And it would not be true if we had not gone through that conflict. So why would God allow conflict in churches? Well, because he allowed all of those previous conflicts and then this conflict, we now have a much better relationship than we ever would have had otherwise.
And it exposed both of you in the ways that needed to happen.
That's exactly right. Yeah, for good.
And it tested you. I don't know who the person is, but like if you're able to have that kind of partnership now, that is of the Lord.
Yeah.
That very well may be ordained because the Lord knew what was in both of your hearts. Both of you needed correction.
Showing both of us, bringing us closer together.
So your father-in-law and I, one of our elders now, I think it was 2005 or 6, we led a mission trip together, and man, were we head to head the whole trip.
I love this story.
I mean, just head to head. And I got done with that trip and I said, I am never going on a trip with that man again in my life. Like, ever. And he, I guarantee, went home to his wife and said, I am never going on a trip with that guy again. And then it was interesting because in 2008 and 9, we began leading together as in the interim leadership of Village Church. And we have been leading together since 2008, and there are a few people I trust and love more than your father-in-law. And but it's interesting because I was 25. He was not a newer Christian, but he wasn't seasoned yet. He came to Christ a little bit later in life, and we were both kind of like in the same maturity phase, if you will. You know what I mean? And like, even though he had more life maturity than far more life maturity than I did, but it was amazing how though that God allowed this thing to happen, and then just 2 years later, it ended up birthing one of what has been probably the closest longest ministry relationship I've had. And by and large, I mean, I don't think we've disagreed on a whole lot, right? We work through stuff and we know how to talk to it. It's great.
You know how to talk to
We're the opposite human beings in every single way, which we realized like on the trip, our oppositeness was actually an asset if we learned how to appreciate that, you know? And so we learned how to like, oh, you're actually wonderful. We have the same values, just opposite mechanisms, you know? But that's cool.
I think conflict is an amazing sovereign plan of God to build his church like he needs to build his church. And I even think in stories in scripture where, the apostle Paul had challenges with it. Was it with John Mark? And they end up planting different churches in different areas because God had different jobs for them. Time to separate, time to do different things. So we never know what God is doing, but we always know Romans 8:28 comes into play. All things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purposes. So whatever we go through, it always has potential.
That's good.
Amen.